The locked garage. In 20 years of marriage, Vivian Harlow had never once seen her husband lock a door inside their own home. Then, on an ordinary Thursday morning in late March, she carried a basket of laundry out to the garage and found a brand new brass padlock hanging on the side door like a closed fist. And just like that, the safest room in her world became the one place she was no longer allowed to enter. She stood there for a long moment, the laundry basket balanced against her hip, staring at that little brass lock as if it might explain itself. It was such a small thing, smaller than her palm, but something about it made her stomach drop in a way she couldn't put into words, the way a person feels when a phone rings at 3 in the morning. The garage had never been just a garage. It was the room where their whole life together had been stored, 1 year stacked on top of another. The bicycles their niece and nephew rode every summer they came to visit. The Christmas boxes with Vivian's handwriting on the sides. The workbench Raymond built himself the first year they owned the house, back when they couldn't afford furniture and ate dinner on folding chairs. And in the center of it all, under a soft gray cover, the old car. The 1967 coupe they had bought together when they were young and foolish and in love, 3 months before he proposed, splitting the cost down the middle because neither of them had enough money alone. For 20 years, Raymond had spent his Sunday afternoons in that garage with the radio on low, his sleeves rolled up, tinkering with that car the way other men watched football. And for 20 years, Vivian had known exactly where every wrench hung on the pegboard, exactly which drawer held the spare fuses, exactly where the coffee can full of loose bolts sat rusting on the shelf. The garage belonged to both of them. Everything in that house belonged to both of them. That was the whole point of the life they had built. She tried the door anyway, foolishly, as if the lock might be decoration. It held firm. That evening, she waited until they were doing the dishes, because hard conversations were always easier when their hands were busy. Raymond washed, and she dried, the same arrangement they'd had since their first tiny apartment, and she kept her voice light when she asked him, "I noticed you put a lock on the garage." His hands went still in the soapy water, just for a second. If she hadn't been married to him for 20 years, she might have missed it. "Yeah," he said. "Had some tools go missing at Walt's place down the street. Figured better safe than sorry." "Missing? Somebody's stealing from garages around here?" "That's what Walt says." He handed her a plate without looking at her. "It's nothing, Viv. Just being careful." And that might have been the end of it, because Raymond Harlow was not a man who lied. In 20 years, he had never given her a single reason to doubt him. He was steady the way an old oak tree is steady. The kind of man who returned shopping carts and remembered the mailman's birthday. And when he told her something, she had always been able to set her watch by it. But 3 days later, on Sunday, she noticed he didn't go out to the garage. Raymond had spent every Sunday afternoon in that garage for 2 decades. Rain, snow, holidays. It didn't matter. 2 hours minimum, sometimes 4, the radio murmuring, the smell of engine grease drifting into the kitchen when she'd bring him a sandwich. It was as much a part of him as his laugh or the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. And that Sunday, he sat in the living room instead, watching a baseball game she was almost certain he wasn't actually seeing, his eyes fixed somewhere just past the screen. "Not working on the car today?" she asked. "Nah," he said, "taking a break from it." Taking a break. From the car. From the car he had loved for 20 years like a third member of the family. Vivian went back into the kitchen and stood at the sink and realized her hands were shaking a little, and she didn't know why yet. Later, she would look back on that Sunday as the moment the ground under her marriage gave its first quiet shift, the way the earth trembles so lightly before a storm that nobody notices except the birds. Vivian Harlow was 52 years old, and she had spent almost 30 of those years teaching people how to dance. Foxtrot, waltz, rumba, swing, 3 evenings a week plus Saturday mornings, she rented the reception hall behind the old banquet building on the corner, rolled a portable speaker to the middle of the floor, and taught retired couples and nervous engaged kids and widows who just wanted a reason to put on nice shoes again. She loved it the way some people love church. On the dance floor, everything was honest. A person's body told the truth even when their mouth didn't. You could feel it in a partner's frame, in their hands, whether they were really with you or already somewhere else, which is exactly how she knew, long before her mind was willing to say it, that her husband was already somewhere else. It wasn't one thing. That was what made it so hard later to explain to anyone, even to herself. There was no lipstick on a collar, no perfume that wasn't hers, no hotel charge on a credit card statement. It was smaller than that, and bigger. It was the way he stopped asking about her classes. For 20 years, Raymond had asked about her Tuesday class the way other husbands asked about the weather, because Tuesday had the characters, old Mr. Abernathy who counted his steps out loud, the young couple who bickered through every Roomba and then kissed in the parking lot. Raymond used to laugh at her stories with his head tipped back. Sometime that spring, the questions just stopped. It was the way his hand stopped finding hers on the couch in the evening. Not dramatically. There was no fight, no cold shoulder. His hand simply stayed on his own knee now, and the 6 inches of cushion between them started to feel like open water. It was the phone calls. That was the part she could not explain away, no matter how she tried. Twice, then 3 times, then more, she would look out the kitchen window and see him standing at the far end of the backyard by the fence, phone pressed to his ear, shoulders hunched in the evening chill, talking low. And every single time, the moment she opened the back door, he would say a few last quick words and slide the phone into his pocket and smile at her. And the smile was the worst part, because it was almost right. Almost. Who was that? Walt wants help with his gutters. Or it was the pharmacy about a prescription. Or it was nobody, a robocall, one of those car warranty scams. Raymond had retired from the plant in January after 31 years, and at first she had blamed everything on that. Men got strange when they retired. Everybody said so. They lost their footing. Her own father had spent the first year of his retirement reorganizing the basement 4 separate times, so she told herself, that's all this was. A good man adjusting to a life with no alarm clock, and for a few weeks, she almost believed it. Then came the nights he started coming home late. The first time, it was a Wednesday in early April, and he called at 6 to say something had come up. An errand for a buddy. He'd grab a bite while he was out. He came home at 9:40. The second time, he didn't call at all. And when his truck finally pulled into the driveway, Vivian was sitting in the dark kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, and she heard him stop at the door, keys in hand, and take one long breath before he came inside. Like a man collecting himself, like a man getting his story straight. "Sorry," he said. "Lost track of time." "Doing what?" "Helping Eddie with a thing." Eddie Falcone was his oldest friend, a mechanic who had worked at the same plant until his knees gave out. "You didn't have to wait up." She looked at her husband standing in the kitchen doorway. This man whose face she knew better than her own, and for the first time in 20 years, she couldn't read it. That frightened her more than anything else. On the dance floor, she could read a total stranger inside of 8 bars of music, and she could no longer read Raymond Harlow. The receipt was an accident. She wanted that understood later, when it all came out. She had not been searching, not then, Not yet. It was the third week of April, one of those spring mornings that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Sunshine and then a cold wind. And Vivian was headed out the door to the pharmacy when she grabbed a jacket off the hook in the mudroom. Raymond's jacket, the tan canvas one, because it was closest, and because in 20 years of marriage their coats and their keys and their lives had never needed sorting into his and hers. At the pharmacy register, digging for loose change, her fingers found a slip of paper in the pocket. A gas station receipt. She almost didn't look at it. She stood right there in line, seconds away from crumpling it with the rest. And then her eyes caught the address printed across the top, and the world went very quiet. The gas station was on Delmore Avenue. Delmore Avenue was on the east side, a solid 40 minutes across town, a place they had no reason to be, no friends, no family, no doctor, no store. Raymond had no business anywhere near Delmore Avenue, except that he did. And Vivian knew it, the way you know a splinter is in deep. Because 11 years ago, they had gone to a retirement party out that way for one of Raymond's old college friends, and driving home, Raymond had pointed lazily out the window at a row of brick buildings and said, "That's where Carol lives now. Remember Carol Whitfield from school?" And Vivian had said, "The one who was at our wedding?" And he'd said, "That's the one." And that had been the whole conversation. 11 years ago. A nothing moment. The kind of thing that dissolves the way 10,000 small moments dissolve. Except it hadn't dissolved. Because she had heard, 2 or 3 Christmases ago, through the grapevine of old acquaintances, that Carol Whitfield had gotten divorced. Vivian paid for her prescription without hearing a word the cashier said. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, holding a gas receipt like it was a live coal, hating herself for the arithmetic her mind was doing and unable to make it stop. The lock, the phone calls at the fence, the late nights, taking a break from the car, the 40 minutes of city between their house and Delmore Avenue, and a divorced woman from his past living somewhere inside that distance. That night in bed, she lay next to her husband of 20 years and listened to him breathe, and she thought about their anniversary coming in the middle of May, 3 weeks away. 20 years. They had talked, back around New Year's, about maybe finally taking the trip they kept putting off, driving up the coast the way they always swore they would. He hadn't mentioned the trip in over a month. She stared at the ceiling and made herself say the word silently, just once, to see if she could survive the shape of it. Affair. The ceiling didn't fall. Her heart kept beating. But something in her chest folded up very small, like a letter nobody was ever supposed to read. She held out 11 more days. She would be ashamed of that morning for a long time afterward. And she would defend it too, both at once, because both were true. It was a Tuesday, the last week of April. Raymond had said at breakfast that he was driving out at 10 to help Eddie with something. There it was again, Eddie, helping Eddie, always Eddie, and then he'd gone upstairs to shower. And Vivian stood in the kitchen listening to the water run through the pipes of the house they had paid off together, and she looked out the window at his truck sitting in the driveway, and something in her simply finished breaking. She was not a snoop. She had never in her life read another person's mail, never scrolled through his phone, never once in 20 years felt the need. She told herself all of this even as her hand was opening the truck's door, even as the smell of him, coffee and spearmint gum and cold metal, rose up around her from the cab. Her heart was slamming. She didn't even know what she was looking for. Another receipt. A note. A second phone. Anything that would either bury her or set her free, because the not knowing had become a stone she carried in her chest from the moment she woke until the moment she finally slept, and she could not carry it one more day. She checked the glove box with shaking hands. Registration, napkins, a tire gauge, an old pair of his reading glasses. She ran her fingers along the seams of the seats, into the console, under the floor mats, and she was leaning across the bench seat, reaching down along the passenger side, when the light in the cab changed. Vivian looked up. Raymond was standing in the open driveway, hair still damp from the shower, holding his boots in one hand, absolutely still. She would remember every detail of him in that moment for the rest of her life. The water spot on the shoulder of his shirt, the way his socks looked on the concrete, the terrible slow blink of a man watching something he cannot make sense of. "Vivian." His voice came out low and strange. "Why are you searching my car?" And maybe if he had sounded angry, she would have crumbled, apologized, invented something about a lost earring. But he didn't sound angry. He sounded hurt, deeply and personally hurt, wounded that she, of all people, could do such a thing. And after 5 weeks of locked doors and whispered phone calls and lonely dinners, that wounded tone struck a match somewhere inside her. She sat up straight in his truck, looked her husband dead in the eye, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Because you locked the garage for the first time in 20 years. The words landed between them in the quiet driveway. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up, an absurdly ordinary sound in the most extraordinary moment of their marriage. Vivian watched her husband's face, waiting for the explanation, the laughter, the anger, anything, waiting for him to say the one sentence that would put her world back together. Raymond opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. And what he did next, Vivian would replay in her mind 1,000 times in the weeks that followed, because he did the one thing she never imagined he would do. He looked at her for a long, unbearable moment, with something in his eyes she couldn't name, something that looked almost like grief. Then he turned around, walked back into the house, and shut the door behind him. Softly, without a single word. The silence that followed lasted 9 days, and it was unlike anything Vivian had known in 20 years of marriage. It wasn't a fight. A fight would have been easier. A fight had heat in it, and heat could be worked with, shaped, cooled into an apology and a late-night conversation at the kitchen table. What settled over the house instead was something colder and far more frightening, a politeness so careful it felt like walking on a frozen pond, both of them listening for the crack. Raymond still said good morning. He still poured her coffee when he poured his own. He still carried the trash out on Monday nights and fixed the loose hinge on the screen door without being asked. But he did it all from behind a pane of glass she could not reach through. And not once, not a single time in those 9 days, did either of them speak of the driveway. She had tried, the first night. She had stood in the doorway of the living room with her heart in her throat and said, "Ray, we need to talk about this morning." And her husband, this man who had held her hand through her mother's funeral and danced with her in the kitchen on 100 ordinary Tuesdays, had looked at her with those same grieving eyes and said quietly, "I'm not ready, Viv. Please." And what could she do with that? You couldn't shake the truth out of a man like fruit out of a tree. She had lain awake that night, doing the terrible arithmetic again. And the arithmetic kept arriving at the same answer. An innocent man explains, she thought. An innocent man laughs, gets angry, throws open the garage door, and says, "Look for yourself, you foolish woman." He does not walk away. He does not say, "I'm not ready." Ready for what? He kept the padlock key on his own key ring now. She had checked, hating herself, while he was in the shower. The spare hook by the mudroom door, where every key in their life had hung for 2 decades. House, truck, shed, mailbox, held everything but that one small brass key. And twice more that week, she saw him at the back fence with his phone. And once, on a Thursday evening, she watched from the bedroom window as her husband stood in the yard in the fading light and ran his hand slowly down his face, the gesture of a man carrying something heavy. And she felt, absurdly, a stab of pity for him, and then hated the pity, and then hated herself for the hating. That was what the not knowing did. It turned every feeling into a knife with no handle. She taught her classes. That was the one mercy of those weeks. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday evenings, and Saturday mornings, she rolled her speaker to the center of the rented hall, and for a few hours the world reduced itself to counts of 3 and 4, to rise and fall, to old Mr. Abernathy whispering 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 under his breath like a prayer. Nobody on a dance floor could hide, but a teacher could. A teacher could smile and correct frames and call out steps with her whole life quietly on fire, and no one would ever know. Almost no one. It was on the second Saturday of the silence, the 3rd of May, that her mother-in-law appeared. Vivian was in the kitchen a little before noon, still in the blouse she'd taught her morning class in, when she heard a car door out front, and then the doorbell. And when she opened the door, there stood Dorothy Harlow, all 5 feet and 2 inches of her, 78 years old, wearing the good blue cardigan she saved for visits, and holding a battered tin box against her chest, with both arms the way other women held purses or small dogs. "Dorothy!" Vivian blinked. "We weren't expecting you." "I know you weren't. That's the entire point of a surprise," Dorothy said, and marched past her into the house on her short, determined legs, already talking, because Dorothy Harlow entered every room in the world mid-sentence. "Is my son here?" "No, don't tell me. His truck's gone. Even better. He'd only hover. This is women's business anyway. Put coffee on, sweetheart. I've been driving for an hour, and my bladder and I are no longer on speaking terms. And then I have something for you." And so 10 minutes later, they were sitting at the kitchen table, and Dorothy set the tin box down between them with a ceremonial little thump and pried off the lid. Inside, packed tight as bricks, stood decades of index cards and folded papers, stained with vanilla and rust and thyme, recipes in a spidery hand that slanted like wind-blown wheat. "My mother's, mine, my sister's, God rest her," Dorothy said, walking her fingers along the cards. "I'm 80 in 2 years, and I've decided I'm not leaving this box for people to fight over when I'm gone. I'm giving things to their rightful owners while I'm alive to enjoy their faces. And this one is yours." She drew out a single card, yellowed at the corners, and held it out. "The almond cake, the one I made for your wedding." Vivian took the card. 20 years dissolved. She was 32 again, standing under a rented white tent, with buttercream on her thumb and Raymond laughing into her hair, the whole improbable future still ahead of them like a road in the morning. The card said "Almond Celebration Cake" in that spidery hand, and below it, in the margin, someone long ago had written the words "For the good days." "I don't know what to say," Vivian managed. "Dorothy, this is... thank you. But why now?" "Well, that's the funny thing." Dorothy settled back, pleased with herself, reaching for her coffee. "It was Raymond who put it in my head. He called me, 6 weeks back, maybe 7, asking all sorts of questions about that cake. Did I still have the recipe? Could I still make it? Of all the things. I said to him, 'What on earth do you want with a wedding cake recipe?' And he got cagey as a cat and said, 'Never you mind, Ma,' and hung up on me, practically. 62 years old that man will be, and still thinks I can't tell when he's up to something. So I thought, well, if the cake's on his mind, the recipe belongs in this house. Sweetheart? Because Vivian had gone very still. 6 weeks. Maybe 7. She was doing arithmetic again, the terrible kind, and the numbers fell into place like tumblers in a lock. 6 or 7 weeks ago was late March. Late March was the padlock. Late March was when her husband had begun to disappear from her in inches. And now here was one more piece that fit nowhere. Raymond secretly asking his mother about their wedding cake in the same weeks he was locking doors and whispering into phones at the fence line. And something about the sheer senselessness of it, the way none of the pieces belonged to the same puzzle, broke the last of whatever had been holding Vivian Harlow upright for 5 weeks. She began to cry at her own kitchen table. Not gentle tears. The other kind, the kind that come up from the basement of a person, ugly and heaving, both hands over her face, the recipe card for her own wedding cake lying on the table in front of her. Oh, my Lord! Dorothy was up and around the table with a speed that betrayed every one of her 78 years, pulling a chair close, gripping Vivian's wrist with one small, strong hand. Sweetheart, sweetheart, what is it? What's happened? I'm sorry. It's nothing. I'm just tired. Vivian Harlow. Dorothy's voice dropped into a register that 40 years of school teaching had forged. I have known you 22 years. You do not cry. At my Harold's funeral, you held me up with one arm and directed the caterers with the other. So you will tell me what is going on in this house, and you will tell me now, because I am old, and I have no time left on this earth for nonsense. And so it came out, all of it, in pieces, into the steam of cooling coffee. The padlock in late March, and the lie about Walt's missing tools, she had asked Walt, weeks later, casually, and Walt had looked at her, blank as a plate. The Sundays that stopped, the phone calls at the fence, the smile that was almost right, the late nights, always Eddie, helping Eddie. The receipt from Delmore Avenue and what lived on Delmore Avenue, the name Vivian had never said out loud until now, Carol Whitfield, and how she'd learned at some Christmas party that Carol Whitfield was divorced now. And finally, the driveway, her hands inside his truck, and the question he'd asked, and the answer she'd given, and the 9 days of glass silence since, and the way he'd said, I'm not ready, and the little brass key that no longer hung with the family keys. Dorothy listened the way old women listen, without interrupting, without gasping, her thumb moving slowly back and forth over Vivian's wrist. But Vivian, even through her own tears, watched the color go gradually out of her mother-in-law's face, watched the coffee sit forgotten, watched a woman hearing a story that did not fit the son she had raised, and being unable to find the seam where it must be false. When Vivian finally finished, the kitchen was quiet a long time. Outside, some neighbor child was bouncing a basketball, the sound echoing off the driveways, steady as a heartbeat. I changed that boy's diapers, Dorothy said at last, very quietly. I sat up with him through the chicken pox and taught him to drive on a stick shift. And I will tell you with my hand on my heart, Vivian, my son does not lie. He never learned how. When he was 7, he broke my kitchen window and confessed before the glass finished falling. She stopped. Her hand had gone still on Vivian's wrist. And I will also tell you that everything you have just described to me sounds like lying, and I cannot make those two things live in the same house, and I am too old to pretend I can. I keep trying to find the innocent explanation, Vivian whispered. I lie awake building them, and every one of them falls down." Dorothy was silent another moment. Then she straightened her small shoulders inside the good blue cardigan, and something shifted in her face, grief moving over to make room for iron. "Then we stop guessing," she said. "Guessing is what's eating you alive. Look at you. There's nothing left of you. No. No. We are going to find out what my son is doing, you and I, quietly, before one wrong word gets said out loud in this family that can't ever be taken back. Because I'll tell you what I know about accusations, sweetheart. A question can be forgiven. An accusation stays on the wall like a smoke stain, 20 years of marriage or no." She reached for her enormous handbag and began rummaging, jaw set. "And we have one advantage, you and I. Two, if you count that nobody on this green earth ever suspects old women of anything." "What's the first?" Dorothy's hand came out of the bag holding her keyring, and she laid it on the table with a small metallic clatter. Among the keys hung a worn leather tag, stamped with a letter R. "I am the mother of this family," she said. "I have kept the spare key to everything any of you have ever owned since before you owned it. Houses, cars, sheds, Raymond's truck included, since the day he bought it, in case he ever locked himself out like his father did bi-weekly." Her chin came up, and for a moment Vivian could see exactly what 40 years of second graders had seen. He'll never think of it. Men never think their mothers count. Vivian stared at the key ring on her kitchen table and felt the ground shift again, except this time she was not standing on it alone. The plan they made that afternoon was simple, because Dorothy had no patience for complicated. Dorothy would come stay for a while. That part would surprise no one. She visited for a week or two every spring. It was practically the calendar. Being in the house, she could watch quietly what Vivian, exhausted, could no longer watch clearly. They would note when Raymond left and when he returned. And the next time he announced he was going to help Eddie, one of them, casually, wife or mother, would find a reason to be out in the world at the same time. And they would learn once and for all where 40 minutes of highway actually led. No confrontations, Dorothy insisted, not until they knew. Hope for the best. Prepare for the truth. And Vivian. Dorothy paused at the front door that evening, her tin box lighter by one recipe card. Her eyes, pale blue and suddenly old, searched her daughter-in-law's face. "Whatever this is, whatever we find, you came to me with it instead of letting it burn the house down. I won't forget that." Raymond came home at 6 that evening and found his mother's suitcase in the guest room. And if there was a flicker of something in his face when Dorothy announced her spring visit had simply come early this year, it was gone before either woman could name it. Dinner that night was almost lively. Dorothy could talk a hole through a fence post, and twice Vivian caught herself nearly laughing, and once she caught Raymond watching her from across the table with an expression of such naked, complicated sadness that her breath stopped. And then he looked down at his plate, and the glass wall slid back into place. The days that followed settled into their strange new shape, and it was Tuesday evening, teaching her class, that the last thread of this story arrived without any of them knowing it, the way important things always arrive, dressed as nothing. She was lining up the group for the foxtrot when the door at the back of the hall opened, and a man came in apologizing with his hands, saying the community center website said drop-ins were welcome. And was that true? Because he was new at this? Fair warning, he was probably hopeless. He was somewhere near 50, tall, with gray coming in at his temples, and the careful, slightly braced politeness of a man doing something alone that he had never expected to be doing alone. He wrote his name on a class card in neat block letters. Grant Mercer. "Recently divorced," he said simply, when she asked what brought him to dance. "Everybody keeps telling me to get out of the house. This seemed better than bowling." He was not hopeless. He was actually rather good, quiet in his frame, respectful of the older ladies who took turns partnering him, quick to laugh at his own missteps. A perfectly unremarkable Tuesday student. And at the end of class, while the others packed up around them, he helped her stack the folding chairs without being asked, and he said, not smoothly at all, in fact, with the clumsy honesty of a man out of practice, "You're a wonderful teacher. You make people feel like it's safe to get it wrong. That's rare." Then he thanked her, and was gone before she could answer. It was nothing. It was one kind sentence from a stranger. But Vivian Harlow drove home that night through the dark spring streets and realized, with a small cold shock somewhere under her ribs, that she could not remember the last time anyone had looked at her while saying something kind. And when she pulled into the driveway, the porch light was off, the house was dim, Raymond's truck sat cooling in the dark, and taped to the refrigerator in Dorothy's spidery hand was a note that made her stand very still in the quiet kitchen with her keys still in her fist. He got a phone call at 8, took it outside, left 10 minutes after. Said Eddie needed him. "Sweetheart, we follow him next time." Next time came 4 days later, on a Saturday. Vivian had just gotten home from her morning class when Raymond appeared in the kitchen doorway with his keys in his hand, and that new, careful voice he used now, the one that sounded like a man reading from a card. Eddie needed a hand with something, he said. He'd be back by supper. And Vivian said fine, because she had learned to say fine, and she watched his truck back out of the driveway. And she counted to 20 the way Dorothy had instructed. And then the two of them, wife and mother, were in Vivian's sedan pulling out after him with 2 cars of distance between, exactly the way it happened in the television programs Dorothy swore she never watched. "Don't get close, don't get close," Dorothy said, gripping the door handle. She had dressed for the occasion in her beige coat and a scarf, as if surveillance were church. "But don't lose him at the lights either." "Dorothy, I've been driving for 35 years. And I've been reading detective novels for 60. 2 car lengths." It would have been funny, and some part of Vivian knew it would be funny someday, one way or the other, 2 grown women tailing a retired plant worker across town on a Saturday afternoon. But nothing in her body registered it as funny. Her hands ached on the wheel. Because the truck ahead of them did not go toward Eddie Falcone's neighborhood. It got on the parkway heading east, and it stayed on the parkway, mile after mile, exit after exit, while the city changed around them, and the knot under Vivian's ribs pulled tighter with every one. And when the truck finally signaled and came down the off-ramp, the sign above the ramp said the words she had known, somehow, since the pharmacy line, that it would say, Delmore Avenue. Neither woman spoke. Dorothy's hand crossed the space between the seats and settled on Vivian's arm, and it stayed there while the truck led them past the gas station from the receipt, past a row of shuttered storefronts, and a laundromat, and a church with a hand-lettered sign, into a block of old brick apartment buildings, 4 stories, iron railings, window air conditioners, the kind of solid, tired street where nobody looked twice at anybody. Raymond's truck slowed. Then it turned in at the mouth of a small parking lot beside the last building on the corner and disappeared from view. Vivian pulled to the curb half a block back, under a maple tree, and shut off the engine. They watched him cross the lot on foot. Even at this distance, even after 20 years, the sight of him held her whole attention. The particular set of her husband's shoulders, the unhurried walk, a canvas bag she did not recognize slung over one shoulder. He went to a side entrance, a plain steel door beside a loading bay. He did not knock. He took out keys, his keys to a building 40 minutes from his home that his wife had never heard of, and he let himself in like a man who belonged there, and the door swung shut behind him, and the street was still. "All right," Dorothy said softly, after a moment. "All right. It's a building. It could be anything. Storage. A fellow from the plant. It could be anything, sweetheart." But her voice had lost some of its schoolteacher iron, and both of them heard it. They waited. That was the part Vivian had not imagined. In all her nights of imagining, the waiting, the sheer ordinary passage of time while your life rearranged itself somewhere behind a steel door. 10 minutes. 20. Dorothy narrated the street to fill the silence. That woman's begonias were leggy. That man walked his dog like the dog owned him. 40 minutes. A city bus sighed past. An hour. 1 full hour. And then the steel door opened, and Raymond came out into the afternoon light. And even from half a block away, both women went silent at once, because something about him had changed. The bag was gone. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, though it was a cool day, and he stood a moment in the parking lot with his face tipped up toward the sun, and he wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket, slowly, and there was something in the gesture so private and so unreadable that Vivian felt she was seeing a stranger wearing her husband's body. He got in his truck. They let him go. Following him home served nothing. Dorothy said, home was where he was going. Look at him. And so they sat under the maple tree on Delmore Avenue, the two of them, and stared at the last building on the corner. An hour, Vivian said finally. Her voice came out flat and far away. An hour inside Dorothy, with his own keys. Dorothy was quiet a long moment. Her thumb had stopped its slow motion on Vivian's arm. "There will be an explanation," she said, but for the first time it sounded less like conviction and more like a woman asking for one. That evening, Raymond was almost cheerful at dinner. That was the cruelest part. He complimented the pot roast twice. He teased his mother about her detective novels, of all things in the world, and Dorothy laughed her social laugh and did not meet Vivian's eyes, and Vivian sat at her own table, turning a single question over and over like a stone in her pocket. What kind of secret makes a man lighter when he comes home from it? She knew what kind. Everyone knew what kind. Sunday he stayed home, and the house was full of his careful politeness. Monday she taught, and came home, and nothing. But Tuesday, while Raymond was in the shower before supper, and Vivian was gathering laundry, the whole thing cracked open 1 inch further, in the smallest, stupidest way, the way it always goes. His gray jacket had slipped from the hook inside the closet door and lay on the floor, and when she picked it up, a paper crackled in the breast pocket, and Vivian stood there with the shower running through the walls of her house, and had one entire silent argument with herself, and lost it, or won it. She never could decide which. It was a piece of notepaper, folded twice. On it, in handwriting she did not recognize, a slanted, hurried hand, was written an address on Delmore Avenue, and beneath the address, a date and a time. Saturday, May 17th, 10 in the morning. And beneath that, underlined twice, 4 words. Don't be late. Everything's ready. No signature. She read it perhaps 30 times. She was still standing in the closet doorway holding it when she heard the water shut off upstairs, and her hands moved by themselves, folding the paper along its creases, sliding it back into the breast pocket, hanging the jacket on its hook. At supper, she ate and spoke and even smiled, and she felt her own smile from the inside and understood, with a distant horror, that this must be what his smiles felt like too. This was what the glass wall was made of. You built it one necessary smile at a time. She showed Dorothy the words on a scrap of paper the next morning, copied from memory, the moment Raymond left to get the oil changed. And she watched her mother-in-law read them, and watched the last of something drain quietly out of the old woman's face. Dorothy set the scrap down on the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, and was silent for the longest time Vivian had ever known her to be silent. "Saturday the 17th, Dorothy said at last. "That's your anniversary weekend." "I know. 20 years the following Wednesday." "I know, Dorothy." The old woman looked out the window at the backyard, at the fence line where her son stood in the evenings whispering into his phone, and when she spoke again, her voice was very quiet and very level, and it was the levelness that frightened Vivian most. "I have been telling you for 2 weeks to hope," Dorothy said. "Hope for the best. Prepare for the truth," I said, like it cost nothing, like it was flour and eggs. She turned from the window, and her pale blue eyes were full and old and terribly clear. "Sweetheart, I want you to hear what I'm about to say, because I will only be able to say it once. If what's behind that door on Saturday is what it looks like." She stopped, steadied. "Then you will not fall apart, because you will have me, and we will handle it the way women have always handled it, 1 hour at a time. But I think that you should begin to prepare yourself. That's all. God forgive me for saying it about my own son. I think you should prepare." Hearing it said out loud at her own kitchen table, in the voice of the woman who loved Raymond Harlow most in all the world besides herself, did something to Vivian that all the weeks of suspicion had not done. It made it real. She did not cry this time. That was somehow worse. She simply nodded and got up and washed 2 coffee cups that were already clean. That night, she lay awake doing a different arithmetic. 20 years, minus whatever was behind the steel door. What remained of a life when you subtracted its central fact? She was 52. She tried to imagine the house without his boots by the door, the Sundays without the radio through the wall, and the strange thing. The thing that shamed her was that grief was not the only thing she felt when she imagined it. Underneath the grief was something small and hard and bright, like a pebble of anger polished smooth. He had done this. Whatever this was, he had taken 20 years of absolute trust and locked it behind a brass padlock, and left her to become a woman who searched trucks and followed cars and copied notes from memory. A woman she did not recognize and had never agreed to become. It was in that frame of mind, that exact weather, that she walked into her Thursday evening class, and Grant Mercer was there again. He had come back Tuesday too, and the Tuesday before. He was, by now, simply part of the class, the way new students became, and if he was better than the others, if the older ladies lit up when he rotated to them, if he stayed after to help with the chairs, none of it was anything. But that Thursday, during the Roomba rotation, the Count brought him around to her, as it eventually brought every student, and Vivian took his frame to demonstrate the walk, the way she had taken the frame of 500 students across 30 years. And her body, which never lied to her, told her something she did not want to know. It was not fireworks. It was not weakness in the knees. Nothing from the movies. Nothing anyone watching could have seen. It was only this. For 4 bars of music, held in the correct and respectful frame of a man she barely knew, Vivian Harlow felt seen. His attention was simply there, complete, undivided, resting on her the way sunlight rests on a windowsill. No part of him was at a fence line or behind a steel door or 40 minutes east. And the sheer relief of it, the animal warmth of being, for 4 bars of music, the only thing in someone's field of vision, went through her like hot water through cold hands, painful precisely in proportion to how cold the hands had gotten. She missed a beat. She, the teacher, missed a beat in a basic rumba walk, and covered it with a laugh and a correction, and rotated him on to Mrs. Delaney, and taught the rest of the hour flawlessly with her heart going like a fist on a door. He caught up with her in the parking lot afterward, at a polite distance, keys in his hand, everything correct. "I wanted to say," he said, and then stopped, and laughed at himself, and started over. "My ex-wife used to say I start every important sentence twice. I wanted to say that Thursdays and Tuesdays have become the best days of my week. That's all. That's the whole speech. I practiced it in the car, and it was longer, but—" He shrugged, a self-deprecating, honest shrug, 49 years old, and out of practice at being a person. "Thank you. Good night, Vivian." "Good night, Grant." She sat in her car for a long time before starting it. The thing to do, the correct thing, was to feel nothing. And she had planned on feeling nothing, and instead she drove home the long way with the window down, and somewhere on the dark parkway she heard herself say, out loud, to nobody, to the radio, "He remembered I like the waltz demonstrations best. 20 years, and Ray doesn't remember what nights I teach." And then she was ashamed, and rolled up the window, and drove home to the house with the locked garage. Dorothy was waiting up in the kitchen, doing the crossword in her robe, and she took one look at her daughter-in-law's face, and put down the pen. But whatever she saw there, she was wise enough or old enough not to name it. She only said, "There's tea." And then, while Vivian poured it, the old woman folded her newspaper very carefully and said the thing they had both been circling for 2 days. Saturday morning, when he goes. Not if. Neither of them said if anymore. We'll be behind him. And whatever is behind that door, sweetheart, we open it. Because I've buried a husband and a sister, and I'll tell you the one thing I know about this life. She looked up, and 78 years looked out of her eyes. It's the not knowing that kills people. The truth just wounds. Vivian nodded and drank her tea, and did not tell Dorothy about the 4 bars of music. That was hers, her own small, guilty coal, and she carried it upstairs and lay down with it next to her sleeping husband. And Saturday came toward them all through the dark like a headlight down a long, straight road. Friday, the 16th of May, was the strangest day of all. Raymond was home the entire day, and he was kind, kinder than he had been in 2 months. He brought her coffee where she sat on the porch. He fixed the wobbling porch rail. At supper, he told a story from the plant she hadn't heard in years, and got his mother laughing so hard she had to take off her glasses. And under the table, briefly, his hand found Vivian's and squeezed it, the first time in weeks, and was gone again. And when she looked at him, her husband of 20 years, less 5 days, she found him already looking back at her with those grieving, unreadable eyes, and he opened his mouth as if there were something in it that wanted out. "Viv," he said, "tomorrow. There's somewhere I have to be in the morning. But after supper, tomorrow, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." The kitchen went absolutely silent. Dorothy had frozen with her glass halfway to her mouth. "You can tell me now," Vivian said. "No." He shook his head slowly, and he looked tired and sorry and like a man at the end of something. "No, tomorrow. After tomorrow morning, everything will make sense. I promise you that. One more morning, Viv, That's all I'm asking for." He went up to bed early. The two women sat in the kitchen without speaking, the clock over the stove ticking off the last hours, and the note in the gray jacket hung in the air between them as if it were pinned there, its 4 words visible in the silence. "Don't be late. Everything's ready." Vivian did not sleep that Friday night, and she knew from the stillness on the other side of the bed, too careful, too complete, that Raymond wasn't sleeping either. 2 people lying back to back in the dark, 4 inches apart, each pretending for the other's benefit, and she thought, this is what it comes to. 20 years, and we've gotten good at pretending in the same bed. Somewhere before dawn, she must have drifted, because she woke to the sound of the shower at 7, and lay listening to her husband move through the rituals of an ordinary Saturday that both of them knew was not ordinary. She had already cancelled her morning class, the first time in 11 years she had cancelled for anything other than fever or a funeral. She had called her regulars one by one on Friday evening from the porch, telling each of them a small smooth lie about a family obligation, and every lie had come out easier than the one before it. And that frightened her too. How quickly a person got fluent. At 8:30, while Raymond was upstairs and Dorothy was in the guest room dressing, the telephone rang, and Vivian picked it up in the kitchen without thinking. "Vivian? It's Grant. Grant Mercer." A pause, and she could hear him regrouping, starting the sentence a second time, the way he did. "I'm sorry to call the number from the class card. That's probably against some rule. I got your message about this morning, and I wanted to make sure everything was all right. You've seemed, I don't know, carrying something these last couple weeks. You hide it well, but..." She stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the backyard fence where her husband whispered into phones, and she felt the kindness in the man's voice land on her like weight rather than warmth, precisely because it was aimed so carefully and asked for nothing. "That's thoughtful of you, Grant. It's a family matter. Everything's fine." "Okay." He clearly knew it wasn't, and he clearly wasn't going to push. And both of those facts registered somewhere in her chest. Then he took a breath, and she heard him step off the edge of something. "Listen, I told myself I wasn't going to do this on the phone, and I'm doing it anyway. Which is exactly the kind of decision-making that got me divorced." A little laugh, aimed at himself. "When whatever this is settles down, whenever that is, I would very much like to buy you a cup of coffee sometime, away from the folding chairs. That's the whole invitation. No speech this time." And there it was, out loud, in her kitchen, at 8:30 in the morning on the worst day of her marriage. Vivian closed her eyes, and what she felt in that long second was not outrage, and it was not nothing. It was the pull of a warm-lit doorway to a person standing in the rain, and she let herself feel it completely, one entire heartbeat of it. The coffee, the conversation, the undivided attention of a decent man who remembered things, an easier road unrolling smooth and simple in her mind. She was 52 years old, and her marriage might be ending 40 minutes east of where she stood, and somebody wanted her company. Nobody would even blame her. That was the thought that did it. Nobody would blame her. Because the moment she heard it in her own head, she recognized it for what it was. A door you told yourself you were only leaning against. And she understood with sudden clarity that whatever was wrong in her house, it was in her house, and it would still be in her house after any cup of coffee in the world, only heavier, because she'd have added a secret of her own to the pile. She had spent 2 months learning exactly what secrets did to a kitchen table. "Grant." Her voice came out quiet and, to her own surprise, completely steady. "I'm married. It's a complicated season, and I won't pretend it isn't. and I think you've probably seen that with your own eyes. But complicated isn't the same as over. And I don't solve things by walking out of them sideways. She paused. You're a good man, and you dance better than you think. And Tuesdays and Thursdays, you'll always be welcome. But the answer to the coffee is no. Silence on the line, and then, softly, without any wound in it. That's about the most honest no I've ever gotten. Your husband's a lucky man, Vivian. I hope he knows it. A beat. See you Tuesday, folding chairs and all. She hung up the phone and stood with her hand still on it, and she heard a floorboard and turned. Dorothy stood in the kitchen doorway in her beige coat, stopped mid-step, and there was no possible pretense that she hadn't heard the last of it. The two women looked at each other across the kitchen for a long moment. That, Dorothy said finally, quietly, is the only part of this whole mess I'm glad I heard. And she said nothing else about it, then or ever. But crossing to the coffee pot, she pressed her small hand once against Vivian's cheek in passing, and that touch nearly undid all the composure the phone call had left standing. Raymond came downstairs at 10 minutes to 9, showered and shaved, wearing his good gray jacket, and the sight of the jacket sent one cold finger down Vivian's spine. He drank half a cup of coffee, standing up. He was visibly somewhere else already, checking his watch twice in 5 minutes, and at 9 exactly, he took his keys off the counter and stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway, looking at his wife and his mother having their innocent Saturday coffee. After supper, he said to Vivian, "Like I promised, everything. Drive safe, Ray." And then the truck was backing down the driveway, and the kitchen exploded into motion, coffee cups abandoned in the sink, Dorothy snatching her handbag, and by 4 minutes past 9, the sedan was rolling east with 2 cars of cushion. And neither woman said a single word for the first 10 miles. The morning was bright and merciless, one of those flawless mid-May Saturdays, lawn mowers and garage sales and children's ball games, the whole ordinary world going about it Saturday, while the two of them drove toward the answer. It was Dorothy who finally broke the silence, somewhere on the parkway, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "Whatever's up those stairs," she said, "you let me go through the door with you, not behind you. With you. Do you hear me? I hear you. And if it's what we think." Her hands were folded in her lap, too still, the knuckles pale. "You say nothing you can't take back. You turn around, and you walk down those stairs, and you fall apart in this car with me. And we plan our next step at a kitchen table like civilized women. He does not get to see it. Not until you decide he does." That's the last piece of advice I'll ever hand you unasked. The exit sign for Delmore Avenue rose up out of the bright morning like something surfacing, and Vivian put on her signal, and her hands were steady on the wheel, and she had no idea how. The truck was already in the little parking lot when they arrived, nose in beside a dumpster, ticking in the sun. Vivian parked on the street, under the same maple, and they watched the plain steel door for a moment. And it was Dorothy who checked her watch and said quietly, 9:40. He's early. Whoever wrote that note, he didn't want to keep them waiting. They crossed the lot in the sunshine, 2 women in their good coats, and the strangeness of it pressed on Vivian with every step, that a person's whole life could pivot on a Saturday morning, while a radio played somewhere and pigeons argued on a ledge. The steel door was unlocked. It opened onto a bare stairwell, concrete steps, a smell of old brick and dust and nothing else. Mail flyers drifted in a corner. Somewhere above them, a door stood open. They could tell by the light falling across the second-floor landing. And they could hear a voice, one voice, Raymond's voice, the words indistinct, the tone unmistakably easy. And then Clear as a bell down the stairwell, her husband laughed. Vivian stopped dead on the third step. Not at the laugh itself, at what was in it. Lightness. That unweighted, unguarded, boyish laugh she had fallen in love with across a used car lot 21 years ago. The laugh that had been missing from her house for 2 months, missing from her marriage. And here it was, spilling down a strange stairwell 40 minutes from home on a Saturday morning, given away free to whoever was behind that door. She gripped the iron railing, and the pebble of anger she had been carrying, polished smooth by weeks of fear, turned over in her chest and showed its sharp side. Dorothy's hand found the small of her back. "With me," the old woman breathed. "Remember." They climbed. The landing was short, one door open at the end of it, light pouring out, and a second voice now, a man's, lower, cheerful, and the word that floated out to them was beautiful, the whole phrase arriving as they came down the landing. "Honest to God, Ray, I still can't believe how beautiful she came out." Vivian's vision went white at the edges. 12 more feet. She would remember the peeling paint on that door frame for the rest of her life. The number screwed to the door. Apartment 201. A rubber wedge holding it open, and she would remember precisely the thought she carried across the threshold. Formed whole and cold. 20 years, Ray, and I get to hear it through a doorway. She stepped into the light with Dorothy at her side, and the world she had built in her mind for 2 months fell down all at once. Silently, like a sheet pulled off furniture. The apartment had no furniture. It had no kitchen table, no sofa, no bed, no woman. The walls of what had once been somebody's living room were hung floor to ceiling with pegboard, wrenches, and sockets in neat descending rows, and work lamps on stands flooded the room with white light, and drop cloths covered a floor stained with decades of other people's living. And there were fenders, an open toolbox the size of a coffin, a rolling cart of parts in labeled bins, and in the center of the room, gleaming under the lamps like something out of a dream. Vivian had stopped letting herself have, sat the car. Their car. The 1967 coupe. Not the faded, patient, half-alive thing that had slept under a gray cover in their garage for 20 years, waiting on Sundays and spare money that never came. That car was gone, and this one stood in its place, whole, finished, its body the deep bottle green of the day they'd bought it, its chrome throwing the lamplight around the room like handfuls of coins, its glass new, its white walls white, restored, complete. Beautiful the way the cheerful voice had just said. Beautiful, the way a promise kept is beautiful. Raymond stood beside it with a rag in his hand and 20 years of Sundays on his face, and next to him, wiping his palms on his coveralls, stood Eddie Falcone. Both men had turned toward the door. Eddie's face was frozen halfway between a grin and confusion. And Raymond, her husband, looked across that blazing white room at his wife and his mother, standing shoulder to shoulder in the doorway in their good coats. And Vivian watched the surprise move through him, and then something that was not surprise. Something breaking open, and the rag slipped out of his hand onto the drop cloth, and he said one word. Viv. Nobody moved. The work lamps hummed. 40 minutes west, in a locked garage, a gray cover lay over empty space, and Vivian Harlow stood in the doorway of apartment 201, with her whole world rearranging itself around her at the speed of light. The padlock, the Sundays that stopped, the phone calls at the fence, the receipts, the hour inside. Don't be late. Everything's ready. Every damning piece turning over one by one and showing its other face. And the first sound that finally broke the silence in that bright room was not a word from any of them. It was Dorothy, beside her, beginning very quietly to cry. Dorothy Harlow had not cried at her husband's funeral. She had held her daughter-in-law's arm and directed the caterers and stood like a fence post through the whole gray afternoon. And so the sound of her crying now, small and helpless in the doorway of apartment 201, did what no shout could have done. It broke the room open. "Ma!" Raymond crossed the drop cloths in 4 strides, and then he stopped short of touching her, his hands out and empty, a man suddenly understanding nothing. "Ma, what's wrong? What are you? How are you even here?" His eyes went from his mother to his wife and back again, and Vivian watched the confusion in them start to curdle into fear. "Viv, what's happened? Is somebody hurt?" And Vivian stood there in the white light with her heart slamming and the beautiful green car gleaming behind her husband like an answer to a question she had gotten catastrophically wrong. And she found she could not speak. It was Dorothy who spoke. The old woman wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, the way children do, and looked up at her son. And what came out of her was half sob and half fury. 78 years old and shaking. "Raymond Harlow, we thought you had a woman." The words landed in the room like a dropped wrench. Eddie Falcone made a strangled sound and became very interested in the toolbox, and Raymond stood absolutely still, and Vivian watched the sentence go into him, watched him turn it over, watched his gaze travel slowly from his weeping mother to his wife, and she saw the exact moment it all assembled itself behind his eyes. The padlock, the calls, the lies about Eddie, the driveway. "Why are you searching my car?" 2 months of it stacking up in his mind the way it had stacked up in hers, only backwards. And she watched the color go out of his face. "A woman," he repeated, barely out loud. "You locked the garage." Vivian's voice came out low and cracked, and once it started, it would not stop, the whole 2 months coming out of her in order, like a wound draining. "You locked the garage, Ray. 20 years, and you never locked anything, and suddenly there's a padlock, and the key isn't on the hook. The key to our garage isn't on our hook. It's in your pocket. And you stopped. You stopped. You stopped asking about my classes. You stopped reaching for my hand on the couch. You stood at the fence every evening whispering into your phone. And every time I opened the back door, you hung up and smiled at me. Do you know what that smile looked like from the kitchen window?" "And Walt never had any tools stolen, Ray?" I asked him. "You lied to me standing at our own sink. And then you started coming home at 10 o'clock smelling like a place I'd never been. And I found the gas receipt from Delmore Avenue in your jacket. And I remembered." Her voice finally caught and tore. "I remembered Carol Whitfield lives out here, and that she's divorced. And I did the math every night for 2 months, lying next to you in the dark. And Ray, the math always came out the same." The name Carol Whitfield seemed to hit both men at once. Eddie's head came up. Raymond closed his eyes. "So I searched your truck," Vivian said. "That's why. You asked me why. And then you walked into the house without a word and left me standing in the driveway for 9 days of silence. So here's the answer. All of it. Because you locked the one room in that house that was always ours. And because I am your wife, and I know your face better than I know my own. And for 2 months, Raymond, your face has been lying to me." The lamps hummed. Somewhere below, on Delmore Avenue, a bus went by. And Raymond Harlow, 61 years old, stood beside the finished car he had spent 2 months resurrecting in secret. And Vivian watched her husband's shoulders come down, not in relief, in surrender, like a man setting down something he had carried too far. And when he finally spoke, he did not defend himself. That was the first thing he did right. "The apartment belongs to Carol," he said quietly. "That's the whole of Carol. She owns this building, her and her brother. It was their uncle's. When I started calling around in February, looking for a garage space I could rent cheap, month to month, no questions, Eddie remembered she had units sitting empty. I've seen her one time, Viv. One time in January, for 20 minutes, to sign a paper and get the keys, and her brother was there the whole while. She doesn't even live on this side of town anymore." He gestured helplessly at the room, the pegboard, the lamps. "The gas receipts were the drives out. The phone calls were parts, Viv. Junk yards and estate sales and a fellow up north with a parts car, and Eddie about the schedule. I took the calls at the fence because you'd have heard me say carburetor through a closed door and it would have been finished. The late nights were right here, every one of them. Eddie can, God, Eddie was here for every one of them." "Every one," Eddie said hoarsely from beside the toolbox. "Mrs. Harlow, I swear on my knees, there was never anything in this room but that car and two old fools arguing about torque." "And the note," Raymond said. "The note in my gray jacket. You must have found the note. That's Eddie's chicken scratch. Don't be late. Everything's ready." Today was the day we put the last of it together. The mirrors and the badging came in Thursday. He wrote it at his kitchen table because I kept getting the time wrong, and I stuck it in the jacket I knew I'd wear. He shook his head slowly. "I was careless with it because it never once occurred to me that anyone in my house was hunting. That's not blame, Viv. Do you hear me? That is not blame. It just never occurred to me, because I thought my secret was invisible. I thought I was being clever." His voice went rough. "I locked the garage because the car wasn't in it. That's all the padlock ever was. We rolled her out on a flatbed the last Thursday in March. 8 in the morning, you were at the market, and I stood in that empty garage and realized the first time you went in there for the Christmas boxes or a screwdriver, it was over. So I bought a lock like a coward, and I told you a lie about Walt with soap on my hands, and I have felt that lie every single day since, Viv. Every day. You want to know why I stopped reaching for you on the couch?" And here his voice finally broke. All the way, in front of his mother and his oldest friend. "Because I was ashamed. Because I'd look at you and hear myself lying and I couldn't. I didn't feel like I deserved your hand until it was done, and I could explain." "Explain what, Ray?" Vivian's own tears had come now, sliding hot and unchecked. "Explain what? It's a car. It was always going to be a wonderful surprise. You didn't need the fence and the whispering and the, why like this? Why 2 months of making me a stranger?" And there it was, the question under all the other questions. And Raymond looked at the concrete floor for a long moment. And when he looked up, Vivian saw something in her husband's face she had seen only twice in 20 years, at his father's grave and in a hospital corridor long ago. She saw him decide to be seen. "Because the pension came in short," he said. "There it is. That's the ugly root of all of it. 31 years at the plant, and when the final numbers came through in January, between the buyout changes and the insurance, it was almost $400 a month less than what we planned around. Every month, Viv, forever. And I sat in the truck in the credit union parking lot with that statement in my hands, and I couldn't come home and say it. 20 years you've watched me be the man who handles it, and I couldn't walk into that kitchen and tell you I'd missed it. That the trip up the coast we finally started talking about, I couldn't see how to pay for it anymore. So He stopped, breathed, made himself go on. So I decided I'd give you something better than a trip. I called Eddie in February. We priced it out. If I did the work myself with his hands and his lift, if I sold my father's rifle and worked the numbers, the money would just make it. And I took the extra shifts Eddie's cousin offered at the shop. That was some of the late nights, too. Cash work, weekends, to cover the parts. And I told myself, 1 more month of lying. Then 2. Then 1 more after that. Because on our anniversary, I was going to put you in the passenger seat of the car we bought when we had nothing, and drive you up the coast like I promised you in 1999. And you'd never have to know the pension came in short at all. You'd never have to know I'd failed. He wiped his face with the heel of his hand, roughly, an old man's gesture. That was the whole plan, Vivian. Protect you from the one thing that was never going to hurt you. And to do it, I hurt you every day for 2 months. I see it now. Standing here looking at your face, I see every day of it. The room was very quiet. Dorothy had gone to lean against the doorframe, small in her good coat, watching her son with an expression that held 40 extra years of understanding. And it was she who finally spoke, her voice worn soft. "You are your father twice over," she said. "That man once hid a lost job from me for 5 weeks. 5 weeks of putting on a tie every morning and sitting in the library." She shook her head slowly. "Sweetheart, listen to your mother one time in your life. A secret kept out of guilt smells like betrayal. A secret kept out of shame only smells like the fear of disappointing somebody. But here is the trouble, son. From the other side of a locked door, the two smell exactly the same." Vivian would carry that sentence for the rest of her life. But in that moment, she was looking past all of them. At the car. She walked toward it slowly, through the lamplight, and the men stepped back without a word, and she laid her hand flat on the deep green curve of the fender, the way you'd lay a hand on a horse, or a coffin, or a christening gown. And it was warm from the lamps, and through the driver's window she could see the bench seat redone in the original ivory, and lying on the seat, square in the middle, was an envelope with her name on it in her husband's blunt, careful hand. "That was for Wednesday," Raymond said quietly, behind her. "For the anniversary. I've got no right to ask, but it says it better than I just did." She opened the door, the hinge swinging silent and new, and sat down in the passenger seat of 1967, and opened the envelope with unsteady fingers. It was 1 page. It said, in part, that 20 years ago he had promised her a life, and had privately worried ever since that he'd delivered her a smaller one, and that this car was the only time machine a working man could build, and that he intended to drive her north along the water until they found the exact spot where she'd once said, through a mouthful of gas station coffee, that she could live and die happy right here. It said, near the bottom, "Ask my mother about the almond cake. There's a cooler that fits behind the seat." And it ended with a line that finally, completely, took her apart. There in the ivory seat, with the lamps blazing. "You asked me once why I never finished the car in 20 years. The truth is, I was never in a hurry. I always figured the car and me, we'd get where we were going, because the best part was already riding with us." She sat there and wept, and through the windshield she watched her husband stand rooted to the drop cloth, being watched in turn by his mother, and she understood that the letter changed everything and settled nothing, and that both of those things were true at once, and that she owed him the same courage he had finally shown her. So when she got out of that car, Vivian Harlow stood in front of her husband and told him about Grant Mercer. All of it, plainly, without softening it, and without flogging herself either. The Tuesdays, the 4 bars of rumba, the phone call yesterday morning at 8:30, the coffee she had wanted for one whole heartbeat before she said no. Raymond went pale and gray in turn, and Eddie found urgent business with the parts bins, and when she finished, the silence stretched long. "I'm not telling you to wound you," she said. "I'm telling you because that's the true cost of the lock, Ray. Not suspicion. Distance. I got so hungry for plain attention that a stranger's kindness nearly knocked me down. Nothing happened, and nothing was ever going to happen. I shut that door myself, and I'd shut it 100 times over. But it cost me something to shut it. And you deserve to know your silence is what carried me all the way up to it." She held his eyes. "You don't get to apologize once tonight and have this over, and neither do I. I searched your truck. I followed you twice. I let your own mother talk me through preparing to leave you. We didn't break anything this spring, either of us. But we bent it, Ray. We bent it good, and bent things need tending. Not just sorry." And Raymond Harlow, who had walked away from her in the driveway, did not walk away. He stood in it, all of it, and nodded slowly, and said the truest thing he'd said in 2 months. "Then we tend it. Every day it takes." He put out his hand, palm up, the old way, the couch way, and after a moment that lasted 20 years, she took it. They drove home in convoy that afternoon, Eddie whooping behind the wheel of the truck, Dorothy riding queenly in the sedan, and Vivian beside her husband in the green coupe, with her hand on his knee, and the windows down, and half of Delmore Avenue turning to look. The following Wednesday, on the morning of their 20th anniversary, Dorothy stood in their kitchen in a flour-dusted apron at 6 in the morning, boxing an almond celebration cake into the cooler that fit behind the seat, the recipe card propped against the sugar bowl, for the good days finally making its meaning plain. The padlock was already gone. Raymond had taken bolt cutters to it himself on Sunday, in front of both women, with a certain ceremony, and hung both garage keys on the mudroom hook, where every key in their life now lived. They pulled out at 7 north, toward the coast, the engine running like a sewing machine, 20 years to the day. And somewhere past the city line, with the water flashing between the trees, and his mother's cake riding behind the seat, and his wife's hair loose in the wind exactly as it had been in 1999, Raymond Harlow reached across the ivory bench and took Vivian's hand, and held it in the open sunlight where anyone in the world could see, and neither of them let go for 40 miles.